My first tomato garden was a disaster. I grew 6 giant tomato plants. They were dark green, taller than my waist, and looked absolutely perfect. I harvested just 14 tomatoes. That's when I learned one of the biggest lies in gardening. A tomato plant can look healthy and still produce almost no fruit. I had followed every instruction on the fertilizer bag. More feed, more nitrogen, more leaves, and that's exactly what I got. Leaves. Lots of leaves, but almost no tomatoes. For years I thought I had bad soil or bad luck, until an 82-year-old gardener showed me a forgotten trick that gardeners used long before modern fertilizers filled store shelves. The method was incredibly simple. It doesn't make your plants grow bigger. It makes them switch from growing leaves to growing fruit. I tried it the next season. The results shocked me. I harvested more tomatoes from 3 plants than I used to get from 6. Buckets of tomatoes. More than 40 pounds from a tiny backyard garden. Since then, I've used this trick every year, and the difference is so obvious that once you see it, you'll never feed your tomatoes the same way again. And the craziest part? You probably already have everything you need to do it. Today, I'm going to show you the simple trick that finally turned my tomato plants into fruit-producing machines. But don't skip ahead. Because the final step, what I do when the very first flower cluster appears, is the part that changed everything. Miss that one step, and you'll end up with giant plants covered in leaves and almost no tomatoes. So how did gardeners get this so wrong? The answer goes back decades, not to some secret society or conspiracy, but to an industry that changed the way we feed plants. During World War II, massive factories were built to produce ammonium nitrate for explosives. When the war ended, those factories didn't disappear. They needed a new market. So the same nitrogen compounds that once fueled munitions began fueling agriculture. And because nitrogen makes plants grow fast, green, and impressive looking, it quickly became the answer to almost every gardening problem. The problem? Tomatoes don't care how many leaves they grow. They care about one thing: fruit. And too much nitrogen can convince a tomato plant to keep making leaves instead of tomatoes. That's the mistake I made for years. And it's the reason my first garden looked incredible, but harvested almost nothing. The forgotten trick I'm about to show you does the exact opposite. It tells the plant it's time to stop making leaves and start making tomatoes. When the war ended in the mid-1940s, enormous factories that had been producing ammonium nitrate suddenly needed a new purpose. So they turned to agriculture. Nitrogen became cheap. Really cheap. And because nitrogen makes plants explode with green growth, it quickly became the star ingredient in fertilizer. The problem? Nobody explained that tomatoes don't need endless leaf growth. They need the right signal to start making fruit. For decades, gardeners were taught that more fertilizer meant better tomatoes. I believed it too. Back in 2004, I walked into a garden center, bought a big box of high-nitrogen fertilizer, and followed the directions exactly. Feed generously, feed often, keep the plants growing. And they did grow. They became enormous, dark green, beautiful, the kind of tomato plants that make your neighbors stop and stare. But when harvest season arrived, I realized something was terribly wrong. I had grown a jungle, not a tomato crop. 6 giant plants produced almost nothing. I remember standing there thinking, how can plants this big have so few tomatoes? That question sent me down a rabbit hole that completely changed the way I grow tomatoes. And the answer had nothing to do with growing bigger plants. It had everything to do with convincing the plant that it was time to make fruit. So I followed the instructions exactly. Feed generously. Keep feeding all season. and my tomato plants exploded. They grew waist-high, dark green, thick stems, beautiful foliage. Honestly, they looked like prize-winning plants. And at the end of the season, they gave me 12 tomatoes. Just 12. I remember counting them because I couldn't believe it. The fertilizer had done exactly what it was designed to do. It made my plants look spectacular. It just didn't put tomatoes on my table. And here's the part that really bothered me. I wasn't the only one. When I started running side-by-side tests and digging through gardening research, I discovered something shocking. Most home gardeners are making the exact same mistake. They think they're growing tomatoes, but they're actually growing leaves. And because of that mistake, many gardeners are unknowingly giving up nearly half of their potential harvest. Imagine planting 6 tomato plants and harvesting the equivalent of only 3. Imagine leaving 40 or even 60% of your tomatoes in the garden without ever knowing it. That's when I realized the problem wasn't my soil, it wasn't my climate, and it wasn't my luck. It was the way I was feeding my plants. And the solution turned out to be surprisingly simple. The crazy part is that this doesn't happen because people are bad gardeners. It happens because they're following instructions that were never designed to maximize tomatoes. They were designed to maximize growth. More green, more leaves, bigger plants. And that same advice is still sitting on garden center shelves today. Every spring, thousands of gardeners buy it, feed their tomatoes generously, and then wonder why they harvested so little. But there was a different way of growing tomatoes long before cheap nitrogen became the answer to everything. A forgotten method from a time when fertilizer wasn't bought in bags, a time when gardeners used what they already had: kitchen scraps, wood ash, compost, and a simple trick that told tomato plants something incredibly important. Stop making leaves, start making fruit. I stumbled onto that method almost by accident. At first, I didn't believe it, so I tested it. Then I tested it again. I grew plants side by side. Same soil, same sunlight, same watering. One group was fed the modern way. The other used this old method. The difference was impossible to ignore. The old method won, not by a little, by a lot. Today, I harvest more tomatoes from 3 plants than I once harvested from 6. More than 45 pounds from a small backyard garden. And it all comes down to one simple change that most gardeners never make. So, what was this forgotten method? Let me show you. Years ago, I found a reprint of a 1943 USDA Victory Garden pamphlet. I almost ignored it, but one paragraph stopped me cold, because it said the exact opposite of what my fertilizer bag was telling me to do. The pamphlet said something surprisingly simple. Feed your tomatoes nitrogen only while they're young, just enough to build roots and healthy stems. Then, the moment the first flower clusters appear, stop the nitrogen. Completely. That one sentence changed the way I garden, because suddenly everything made sense. My plants weren't failing because they needed more fertilizer. They were failing because I kept telling them to grow leaves. The old gardeners understood something we had forgotten. Tomatoes have 2 different jobs. First, build the plant. Then, build the fruit. And those 2 jobs require different nutrition. Once flowering starts, the plant needs less nitrogen and far more phosphorus and potassium. The old pamphlet recommended 2 simple ingredients: bone meal for phosphorus, wood ash for potassium. Nothing fancy, nothing expensive, just a way of telling the plant. The growing phase is over. It's time to make tomatoes. I tried it myself, and what happened next completely changed my harvest forever. Because there is one more step I take when the very first flowers open. And that's the step that turns good tomato plants into fruit factories. The best part? These weren't expensive products. They were things most families already had. A little bone meal, a little wood ash. That's it. Back in the 1940s, commercial fertilizer was hard to get, so gardeners learned to use simple materials that were already sitting in their kitchens, sheds, and fireplaces. But I wasn't about to trust a gardening pamphlet from 1943 just because it sounded interesting. I wanted proof. So I tested it. I built 2 identical tomato beds. Same tomato varieties, same soil, same amount of sunlight, same watering schedule. Everything was identical except for one thing: how the plants were fed. On one side, I used the modern method, balanced fertilizer all season long. On the other side, I followed the old 1943 method, nitrogen early, then phosphorus and potassium once flowering began. I ran the comparison for 2 full growing seasons, and by the middle of summer, I could already see something strange happening. The modern plants looked bigger, greener, more impressive. But the old method plants were covered in something the others didn't have: flowers, and then tomatoes. Lots of tomatoes. By harvest time, the difference wasn't even close. What I measured at the end completely changed the way I grow tomatoes forever. After 2 full seasons, the results were undeniable. The old 1943 method won both years, and it didn't win by a few extra tomatoes. It won by enough that I completely changed the way I feed my plants. I stopped arguing with the results, because numbers don't care about opinions. And that's exactly why you'll never see this method advertised in the garden center aisle. There isn't a big bag of expensive fertilizer waiting at the end of it. There's nothing flashy to sell, just a different way of feeding your tomatoes. So why does it work? The answer is surprisingly simple. Nitrogen is the growth nutrient. It tells a plant, get bigger, make more leaves, grow more stems. And tomato plants are constantly making decisions. Think of them like tiny solar-powered factories. Every day their leaves produce sugar from sunlight. Then the plant has to decide where that energy goes. Should it build more leaves, more stems, or should it build flowers and tomatoes? Here's the problem. If you keep giving a tomato plant lots of nitrogen, you're sending it one message over and over again. Keep growing. You're not finished making leaves yet. So the plant keeps investing its energy into green growth. Bigger plants, more foliage, more branches, but fewer tomatoes. The old gardeners discovered something important. If you change the nutrition at the right moment, you change the plant's priorities. You stop telling it to make leaves and start telling it to make fruit. And that moment happens much earlier than most gardeners realize. Scientists have a fancy name for this. They call it photosynthate partitioning. But don't let the term scare you. All it really means is this. Where does the plant send the energy it makes every day? Think of your tomato plant as a tiny factory. Every leaf is a solar panel. Every sunny day, the plant produces sugar and energy. Then it has to make a decision. Should it spend that energy building more leaves, or should it spend it making tomatoes? Here's the mistake most of us make. When we keep feeding high nitrogen all season long, we're standing over that factory shouting, "Build more leaves, get bigger, grow more branches." And the plant listens. It pours its energy into foliage. The fruit gets whatever energy happens to be left over. That was my entire 2004 garden in one sentence. A beautiful leaf factory that barely grew any tomatoes. But the moment you stop the nitrogen when flowering begins, everything changes. The message changes. Suddenly, The plant is no longer being told to build more leaves. Now it's being told, reproduction has started. It's time to make fruit. And that's when the factory begins sending more of its energy into flowers, and eventually into tomatoes. That's the turning point. The exact moment your tomato plant switches from growing bigger to growing food. And there is one thing I do right at that moment that makes the difference even bigger. Phosphorus and potassium are the other half of the story. Phosphorus helps power flowering and root development. Potassium helps build the tomatoes themselves, the size, the firmness, the color, even the sweetness. But there is one more nutrient that almost nobody talks about. And this is the piece that changed everything for me. Calcium. Because calcium follows a completely different set of rules. Here's the strange part. A tomato plant can't simply move calcium around whenever it wants. Scientists call this calcium mobility. I call it the use it or lose it nutrient. Once the plant sends calcium into a leaf, it's stuck there. Forever. The plant can't take that calcium back out later and hand it to a developing tomato. It doesn't work that way. Which means one thing. If fresh calcium isn't available at the exact moment those tiny tomatoes begin forming, the fruit may never get enough of it. And that's why so many gardeners end up with beautiful plants, beautiful flowers, and then disappointing fruit. The timing matters. In fact, the timing is everything. Because the first flower cluster is the moment when I make one final change, and that single step is what turned my tomato plants into fruit factories. This is also why so many gardeners struggle with blossom end rot. They see the black spot on the bottom of the tomato and assume the soil doesn't have enough calcium, so they add more and more. But most of the time, that isn't the real problem. The real problem is timing, because calcium has to reach the fruit while that tiny tomato is just beginning to form. Miss that window, and the damage is already done. That's why simply dumping more calcium into the soil often doesn't fix anything. The issue isn't always how much calcium you have. It's whether the plant can deliver it at the exact moment the fruit needs it. And that's the kind of detail you'll never find on the fertilizer bag. So here's the system I use now. The simple 3-phase method that changed my harvest completely. Phase 1. Build the plant. For the first 3 to 4 weeks after transplanting, I feed nitrogen forward. Not heavily, just enough to help the young plant do what it needs to do. Build roots, build stems, build a healthy frame. At this stage, nitrogen is your friend. You want a strong, vigorous plant. But then something important happens. The first flower cluster appears, and that's the signal. The moment most gardeners keep feeding nitrogen, I do the exact opposite. Then the moment I see that very first flower cluster begin to open, I switch completely. I stop pushing nitrogen. No more telling the plant to grow bigger. No more telling it to make more leaves. Instead, I change the message. Now I feed the fruit. I move to a low nitrogen, higher phosphorus, higher potassium fertilizer. Think of something like a 5-10-15 ratio. A smaller first number, larger second and third numbers. At the same time, I make sure fresh calcium is available as those first tiny tomatoes begin to form. That's it. That's the entire secret. Build the plant first, then feed the fruit. Most gardeners never make that switch. They keep feeding for growth when they should be feeding for production. And the difference isn't small, it's dramatic. The same backyard that once gave me just 12 tomatoes now gives me baskets, buckets, more than 45 pounds of tomatoes from only 3 plants. I didn't buy a miracle fertilizer. I didn't change my soil. I didn't change my climate. I changed the timing. And once you understand that one principle, you stop growing giant leafy tomato plants and start growing tomato harvests. Last season, those 3 plants were all heirlooms: a brandywine, a Cherokee purple, and a black crim. They grew in the exact same backyard that once gave me one of the most disappointing tomato harvests of my life. Same dirt, same climate, same gardener. The only thing I changed was this: when I fed nitrogen and when I stopped. That's it. But I wanted more than a pile of tomatoes on a scale. I wanted proof that the plants were actually performing differently. So I pulled out my Brix refractometer. It's a simple little tool that measures sugar content in fruit. And higher sugar means something important. The plant successfully moved more of its energy into the tomatoes, not into leaves, not into stems, into the fruit. The numbers were higher across the board. More tomatoes, sweeter tomatoes, better flavor. Because instead of building a giant leafy plant, I had finally convinced the plant to invest its energy where I wanted it, into the harvest. That was the moment I realized something. I didn't need better soil. I didn't need expensive products. I didn't need a bigger garden. I just needed to stop feeding my tomatoes like I was trying to grow leaves. Now, maybe you're thinking, sure, but that only works in your garden. I thought that too. Until my neighbor, Carol. Back around 2008, she was dealing with exactly the same problem I had years earlier. Huge tomato plants, dark green leaves, beautiful growth, and almost no tomatoes. She was feeding with a balanced 20-20-20 fertilizer all season long, because that's what she had always done. I asked her one question: what if your plants don't need more growth? What if they need a different message? I convinced her to try an experiment. The moment her first flower clusters appeared, she switched. Less nitrogen, more phosphorus, more potassium, something closer to a 5-10-15 ratio. That was it. No new soil, no fancy products, no expensive amendments. The plant doesn't lie. If a tomato plant keeps making leaves instead of fruit, it's trying to tell you something. Most of the time, it isn't the soil, it isn't the seed, and it isn't bad luck. It's the feeding schedule. More specifically, it's when the nitrogen stops. That one decision changes everything. Because the moment you stop telling the plant to grow bigger, you finally give it permission to start growing tomatoes. And here's the funny thing. There isn't much money in telling gardeners to buy less fertilizer. There isn't much money in telling people that timing matters more than another bag from the garden center. But that's exactly what years of testing taught me. The biggest gains in my harvest didn't come from spending more. They came from feeding differently. So if what I've shared today is starting to click, if you're beginning to realize that tomato production is often a nutrition and timing problem, not a luck problem, then I want to show you the entire system, the exact schedule, when I feed, when I stop, what I use at flowering, and how I keep my plants producing all season long. Because once you understand the timing, you'll never look at tomato fertilizer the same way again. So why don't more people talk about this? The answer is surprisingly simple: economics. After World War II, the country had enormous factories capable of producing huge amounts of ammonium nitrate. Those factories had been built for wartime production. But when the war ended, they needed a new purpose. So they turned to fertilizer. Almost overnight, nitrogen became cheaper and more abundant than ever before. An entire fertilizer industry grew around that surplus, and that's still the world most of us garden in today. Now think about what the old 1943 method actually asks you to do. Use simple amendments. Feed nitrogen only when the plant is young. Then stop. Switch your focus to feeding flowers and fruit. That's it. There's no miracle product, no expensive program. And the most important step of all, it's simply not buying more nitrogen once your tomato plants begin to flower. You can't put "stop buying this product" on a shelf. You can't package "use less" in a shiny bag. But sometimes the biggest improvement in your garden doesn't come from adding something new. Sometimes it comes from knowing when to stop. And that single change completely transformed my tomato harvest. Here's the part that finally made everything click for me. Most gardeners judge a fertilizer by what happens a week or two after they use it. Did the plant get bigger? Did the leaves turn dark green? Does it look lush and healthy? If the answer is yes, we feel like the fertilizer worked. And that's exactly what nitrogen does. Fast. It gives you an immediate, visible result. Big growth, deep green leaves, a plant that looks incredible. But here's the question I had to ask myself. Is that actually what I planted tomatoes for? I didn't plant a garden to grow leaves. I planted a garden to grow tomatoes. And those two goals are not always the same thing. A fertilizer can make your plants look spectacular, while quietly reducing the amount of fruit they produce. That's the trap I fell into in 2004. I thought I had successful tomato plants. What I really had were beautiful, expensive leaf factories. So in a way, many fertilizer programs are optimized for the thing you can see immediately: green growth. Because that's what makes a gardener feel like they got their money's worth. But a tomato plant should be judged at harvest time, not 2 weeks after feeding. The real question isn't, how green are the leaves? The real question is, how many tomatoes are in the basket? Now let me be careful here because I don't want to overstate this. Let me be careful here. Nitrogen is not the enemy. Young tomato plants genuinely need it. During those first 3 or 4 weeks after transplanting, the plant is building its engine, its roots, its stems, its leaf surface. Those leaves are the solar panels that will feed the plant for the rest of the season. That's why my own schedule uses nitrogen early. The problem isn't feeding nitrogen. The problem is never being told when to stop. Most fertilizer programs keep you feeding right through flowering, week after week. More green growth, more leaves, more stems. And every time you do that, you're spending money to grow parts of the plant you can't eat. That was my entire 2004 garden. A huge, beautiful, well-fed tomato plant that barely produced tomatoes. But here's the final piece. The one I mentioned at the beginning. The one that changed everything for me. On every indeterminate tomato plant, when that very first flower cluster appears down low, I remove it. The whole thing. Pinched off. Gone. I know. That sounds completely backwards. A video about getting more tomatoes, and I'm telling you to remove the first flowers? Stay with me. Because that tiny sacrifice changes where the plant sends its energy during the most important stage of its life. And what happens next is the difference between an early tomato and a season-long harvest. I tested this the same way I test everything. I didn't pinch every plant. I pinched one, and I left the others alone. Same variety, same soil, same watering, same sunlight. Everything identical except for that one decision. By the end of the season, the difference wasn't subtle. The pinched plant was ahead of every other plant in the row. More growth, more flower clusters, more production. The records didn't lie, and that was the moment I stopped thinking of that first flower cluster as a tomato I was losing. I started thinking of it as an investment. A small sacrifice that pays you back for the rest of the season. Of course, you'll never see a fertilizer bag telling you to remove a flower. You'll never see a garden center display saying, "Buy less fertilizer and pinch off your first blooms," because neither of those things sells a product. But they can grow a better harvest. And here's what finally clicked for me. Pinching that first flower cluster and all the sucker decisions you make later in the season are really the same thing. They're both about directing energy. Every time you prune, pinch, or change the way you feed your plant, you're answering one question. Where do you want the plant's energy to go? Into more leaves or into more tomatoes? Once you start thinking that way, everything changes. Because growing tomatoes isn't really about growing the biggest plant. It's about managing where the plant spends its energy. And when you learn to control that, the harvest takes care of itself. So that's the entire method. Build the plant first, then change the message. The moment the flowers appear, stop pushing nitrogen. Feed for flowers and fruit instead. Phosphorus, potassium, fresh calcium at fruit set. And if you're growing indeterminate tomatoes, sacrifice that very first flower cluster so the plant can build a stronger engine for the rest of the season. That's it. No miracle product, no expensive program. Just a forgotten method that gardeners used long before fertilizer bags filled the shelves. And the best part? You don't have to believe me. Do what I do. Test it. Pick one plant this season. Treat it differently from the rest. Keep notes. Count the tomatoes. Weigh the harvest if you want. Then let the numbers decide. Because tomato plants don't care about opinions. They tell the truth at harvest time. And I think you'll be surprised by what they say. And before you go, if you enjoy these old, forgotten gardening tricks, come back for the next one. I'll show you the $2 pantry ingredient I use to stop ants from farming aphids on my pepper plants without spraying a single chemical. Until then, grow less foliage and more food. I'll see you in the next one.